Good morning. It is 9:55 a.m. on Sunday, June 10th, 2018. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. It's Sunday, which means I'm continuing my rewatch of The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. And the episode we're watching today is entitled The Boredom of Haruhi Suzumiya. Now, because of the non-chronological order in which we are watching the episodes, this is one of the first episodes where things get a little weird as a result. Now, I'll continue to talk more about why I still think this is a better way to, a better sequence, or at least I prefer it, as opposed to it's making an objective quality judgment or anything. But I think it's kind of fun to have these little things that aren't quite explained yet that we're going to wait to see how they turn out. And then also references to things that, that have happened, but we're not quite sure about and we're going to see. And I think the episode is actually pretty well suited for that because we get just hints at things without actually spoiling things. And I think that that's a really fun experience personally. So the plot of this episode is definitely sort of a self-contained side story where Haruhi decides that the SOS Brigade is going to enter a local baseball tournament. And just dealing with that is kind of the plot of the episode. But let's talk a little bit about the things that happen in this episode that are unexplained or surprising because of the non-chronological order. First and foremost, probably, is the presence of Itsuki Koizumi, who is now here. Now, we remember him from the movie they made in that first episode we watched. But he has not yet been, and he's like in the opening credits. We know that he's a main character. We saw him in the closing credits as well. But at the same time, he had not yet been introduced as of the last episode we watched, The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya Part 2. So he's here and obviously just part of the group now. And we can see that his dynamic as part of the overall chemistry is essentially just, I'm sitting a little off center. His chemistry or his dynamic is basically that he just pleasantly agrees with anything that Haruhi says, and Kyon finds that somewhat annoying. So we don't know how he was introduced to the group. We're going to find that out as we progress. But for this episode, he's here. He seems to also be in on what's going on with Haruhi. And both Yuki and Mikuru know that too. And so we've also get with Mikuru a little bit more of an indication of what's going on with her. And we now know Kyon knows what's going on with her. And again, because Haruhi has talked about time travelers as a big part of the sort of weirdness she's looking for, a couple of the things that... Yeah, that pickle jar is distracting me. Sorry about that. I am not endorsed by Vlasic pickles. Mikuru references time planes again. And in this context, when she mentions having a friend, Kyon wonders, like, a friend from when? And so that suggests that maybe she's a time traveler, and whatever it is that she is, Kyon knows about it now, in the now of this episode. So obviously that's different. There's a few other minor differences because, there's more stuff in the room. There's more various outfits and costumes for Mikuru. And, but from a plot perspective, what we also get reference to is an event that Kyon describes as the world having developed a sudden case of leg cramps. We introduce a couple of new terms, like closed space, that sounds like it might end the world, and suggestion that Haruhi, whatever's going on with her, is capable of ending the world if she gets too bored or frustrated, which is kind of even a step up beyond what, where we left, obviously, was, where we left off last time was Yuki explaining that she's an alien and that she's here to study Haruhi, essentially, who's also not a normal human in ways that are not fully explained yet. But here we get a little bit of a hint of what all that's about. And there's a reference to a time where something dire was happening. Kyon was there with Haruhi, and according to Koizumi, he had some sort of a trick that he played, or some sort of a trick that ended that situation. And we know where it's referenced because he says, hey, this is looking bad. Could you do that again? And Kyon says, no, but we don't know what that is. And we get a couple of flashes, references to some weird monster thing in the sky. And then we also get a moment later with Yuki where we seem to flashbacks to some other previous event with her when the backgrounds get all weird and we're talking about the spells. So there's a lot going on in this episode that references the events in the past tense that we haven't seen yet. And so that's obviously one of the, the hurdles of, the non-chronological order. However, in my opinion, I think as it plays out, all of those are kind of fun. Like, oh, what's going on with that? As opposed to, what's happening? I don't know. I'm confused. So I found it, even on my first watching, a pleasant confusion. And I think that I appreciated it personally. I think it was, it's kind of neat. It hints at stuff. And for example, when Koizumi asks, whatever that trick was that you did to get out of the other situation, could you do it now? It doesn't tell us what that was. And so we're not spoiled, really, for the resolution of that other event once we get to see it. So I like all of that personally. Your mileage may vary. Maybe you prefer watching it all in chronological order so that the plot makes sense in that regard. And I could totally see that. But in the meantime, this is starting to get at why I like it to be this way. The other element that makes it interesting that way, in my opinion, this way, is that this is a side story, right? This episode is fun, but it's also self-contained. Whereas if we were watching in chronological order, we get the first 6 parts of the Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya arc, which are really like the main arc of these, of the first season. And then we get a bunch of side story episodes where they're all self-contained stories. And that's okay, but the pacing of that leaves the climax, the emotional climax of the season, happening at episode 6 instead of episode 14, I think. And so I like it where we take the the main A story arc and we space it out with some of these filler episodes, especially when it produces some of these fun things, like especially given that the student film that they make is actually chronologically towards the end of the second season. There's lots of things in it where we can't help but wonder, like, how is that going to come into play? What's going on there? And I like waiting for those things and then being surprised when it's like, oh, so that's how they get the whatever. Anyway, so lots of elements of the non-chronological storytelling here. But let's talk about the episode itself. So we have the 4 non-Haruhi members of the SOS Brigade hanging out in the club room, so still a thing. And now they have a completed, roster. And Haruhi shows up with a flyer for a baseball tournament, and it essentially signs everyone up because it's going to be essentially good publicity for the SOS Brigade, was kind of the implication. Although we get suggestion later that it's less about that and more about Haruhi was bored because nothing had happened for a while and wanted something to do, and maybe just saw a baseball tournament and thought that would be fun, and so let's do it. And then the justification that it would be good publicity for the SOS Brigade probably came second. But in the meantime, we may recall from the introduction episodes of Haruhi that she is very good at sports. She is sort of uncannily good at everything she tries. And so she also, though, seems somewhat unaware that that's how unusual that is. And so she kind of just seems to assume that she can take the 5 total members of the SOS Brigade, randomly conscript 4 new players, and then just win a championship. But the fun of this is, as Kyon kind of suggests, is because of the weird nature of Haruhi's powers, which are still pretty much unexplained in this episode, he worries they might actually win, and that would be a problem because that would be super weird and attract attention. So, what other players, right? So we've got Yuki, who, as we have continued to see, is just not really engaging at all. We also note not wearing her glasses in this episode. That's another artifact of the non-chronological story. We have Mikuru, who is, reluctant but bullied into it by Haruhi. We have Koizumi, who is just saying, I think sounds like a great idea. And when Kyon is annoyed by that, he points out, well, which is better, for us to be out there looking for aliens or for us to play baseball? And it's kind of hard to argue that. It's like if you're trying to be less weird. But they have 5 with Haruhi, and they need 4 more. And so now we get to meet 3 of the other side characters we saw in their movie. We see Miss Tsuruya, who we are introduced to as Mikuru's friend. And apparently, she's just a classmate and not from another time, as Kyon wonders. And she acts pretty much like we saw her in that student movie. She laughs a lot, and, it seems fairly playful. We also bring in Haniguchi and Kunikita, who we have met before but are now given names as, Kyon's classmates that he's been eating lunch with. And so they're brought in. We also bring in Kyon's sister, who I think doesn't actually get a name. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I don't think she's actually named in the story. She is Kyon's sister. And for that matter, it's a little bit like how Kyon early on, and it's kind of dropped, they don't follow up on it a whole lot. Kyon mentions how Kyon is a nickname that he doesn't especially like, but we don't actually ever know what his regular name is. And so it's kind of an interesting thing in that regard. But in any event, Kyon's sister is 10. And so for her to be brought along to be on this baseball team that's open to the public is a little bit, in the normal sense, unreasonable, because, how is she going to compete with, everyone else who's, high school or older? And Haruhi calls him on it, and he basically makes excuses. But we learn from his voiceover narration, he explicitly brought her because he was hoping to minimize the chances that they might actually win. Because that would be super strange, and everyone would would attract a lot of attention. But even then, Haruhi basically is so convinced they're going to win that she says, "Well, maybe it'll be a handicap. It wouldn't be good for us to win too easily." And so she's essentially still thinking, "Yeah, it's fine, I guess, for one of our players to be 10 years old." But I guess that jumps in a little later because first we do have the baseball practice where she just brings everyone down in their normal school clothes, with Mikuru still in her little like stewardess outfit, and just demands of the baseball players use of the field and their equipment. And we might have suspected, given the way she handled the computer club last time, that yeah, she's going to use Mikuru to do it. And in this case, basically plays on the high school baseball players' attraction to a beautiful girl like Mikuru in a tight outfit, and just kind of say, come on, you don't want to say no to her, do you? And the baseball practice, I think, is hilarious. We see the reaction of our main cast, right? We have Mikuru, who is so terrified at the coming baseball that she literally huddles into a little ball, protects her head with the glove, and is just literally huddling in a crying mess. We have Koizumi, who at least makes an effort, and he's not terrible. We have, in fact, he's pretty good considering. Like, he's pretty good in an ordinary sort of way. And we have Kyon, who's struggling to accomplish anything. But the funniest, I think, just in terms of the response to trying to field grounders, is Yuki, who literally just stands there completely motionless as various balls fly past her head, and only acts at all if it's going to hit her, at which point she moves the glove just exactly to where to catch it, and then lets it just drop to her feet, which I think is it's fun to watch. She is preventing the ball from hitting her, but otherwise not participating really at all. And so Haruhi demands of everyone that they're going to hit 1,000 grounders and field 1,000 grounders. And once it becomes clear that the fielding from her classmates is not going especially well, she just basically drafts the rest of the baseball team to field all of her hits. And according to Koizumi, she says up front she's going to hit 1,000, and she hits exactly 1,000 of them. And just effortlessly hits every single one tossed to her, and they all go exactly where she wants. And so she is pretty much going full steam ahead on this thing. So then when we get to the actual game, it goes pretty much like we might have expected, with a few wrinkles. Like, so for one, Haruhi hits the ball easily every time she gets up to bat. But she's not hitting a home run. She's getting like second base. And I think she gets to third base once. But, which is interesting, just because we could imagine it playing out where she just gets a home run every time. But key to this, I think, is that she actually doesn't think of herself as one of the best players out there. She thinks of herself as, I'm pretty good. We're going to be great as a team. And so it's interesting that, given the suggestion that she is able to will things, unconsciously will things into happening, and that theoretically her boredom or frustration could end the world, it's interesting that she goes up to bat and gets second base. It's also interesting, I think, that when she gets up to pitch, she is very good at throwing a straight pitch down the strike zone, but that's all. And once the other team figures out that that's all she's throwing, they're able to hit a lot of them, and they start doing really well. And she is not able to change it up. She struggles with imagination. And I think that's interesting from a character perspective. The idea that, and that's something that the rest of the series is going to continue to explore, is what exactly is her deal? Because right now we still don't kind of fully know. We know she's a bully in a lot of ways, but that it's frequently coming from a place of wanting, she wants the club to go well, and she wants the club to have things and to move forward, but she is certainly willing to abuse Mikuru and drag Kyon around by his tie. And to get what she wants, she'll basically do whatever it takes. We definitely see that. And we see that that's kind of a dark side of her. And we also see that, we learn that her negative emotions can have disastrous consequences in some way. But what exactly, what's going on with her beyond that? And the fact that she does actually seem to care in some subtle ways what Kyon thinks is interesting too. And that's something, again, we'll continue to explore, because as we see it here, he talks about how often she just doesn't even listen to his objections. But we do occasionally see her respond to them, even if she's dismissive. And then towards the end, when they have won the game and he's suggesting a reason to not pursue the tournament further and forfeit, she basically says, well, if you're okay with it. And this suggestion that, and we also get a nice subtle moment where when she is forced Mikuru into the cheerleader uniform, giving us yet another one of the series of running gags where we get to hear from outside Haruhi bullying Mikuru into wearing some sort of an outfit, and her sort of crying and screaming in, it's like, hey, come on, put it on. Anyway, we talked a little bit about some of the problematic aspects of that sort of gag, but at the same time, it's played definitely silly here, and it's also made more complex by the fact that Mikuru continues to put up with it in a way that at one point she actually tells Kyon, don't be too nice to me or it'll happen again. And so we don't know exactly what that's going on, but it's kind of an ominous suggestion that Haruhi is jealous of Kyon paying attention to Mikuru. And we see that again when she says, maybe we'll put your hair up in a ponytail. Then she looks over at Kyon and says, no, we're not going to do that. And so we see the beginnings of that here. And for now, it's still played. This is fairly kind of a little bit of a dark thing, just because we could imagine an ordinary response of someone being jealous to be angry or frustrated or sad. But the suggestion here is that she could end the world if she feels too angry or frustrated. And so sure enough, the game is not going well, because no one else can even barely make contact with the ball. They're not especially good at fielding, barely competent at fielding, only enough to keep the other team from just completely blowing them out of the water. But it looks like they're going to lose by 10 in only inning 3. And at this point is where things start to go bad. We have Koizumi, Yuki, and Mikuru all seem to independently get notification in some way that something bad's going to happen. This is where we hear Koizumi talk about a closed space bigger than any we've ever seen. We don't really know what that is yet, but it's suggested that it's potentially world-ending. And it's because Haruhi is frustrated that the team is losing. And we had, little bits that we dealt with earlier, Haruhi's just demands and, attempt at signals, and even the cheerleader outfits, doing all of these various tricks to try to win, and it's not working. Because, of course, we know it's it was sort of crazy to begin with. It was an unrealistic expectation for her to think that they could win. And it's not going well. And there's a nuance to it that's going to start to become more of an obvious pattern as we go, which is that her frustration with how it's going, and on top of how it is actually going, is sometimes a little bit contingent on how the various people in the group are reacting. But I'll just sort of ping that out there for now, and you guys can we'll see how that develops over the series. But in the meantime, it's time though to learn more about Yuki. all we knew from the last one is that she mentioned she's an alien, and we've certainly seen her behave in weird ways, suggestions that Mikuru and Koizumi both know that something's up with her. But it becomes clear, if they lose, the world could end. So Yuki casts a spell and essentially does something magic as far as we can tell. And now the bat hits a home run no matter who's swinging it, homing mode. And so imagine this from the perspective of someone watching the game. You've got a college level team favored to win the tournament up against a team of, misfits that are barely able to even hit the ball, losing by 10 in inning 3, but then suddenly hits 10 home runs in a row. And at that point, it's, we see the other team like really acting angry and suspicious, and who wouldn't, because something's fishy with that, right? Like, what's going on? Like, that's weird, but how would you cheat that, right? So everyone is a little concerned, and so at this point, Kyon suggests, okay, well, let's stop the cheating before it gets out of control. And so they immediately go back to striking out every time. And it's all complicated. But without it being so obvious in the cheating, they try to say, well, what's another way we can make sure we win without it getting too unreasonable? And so this is where they switch up the pitching. So Kyon is pitching, and now Yuki is catching, and she uses her magic to make essentially the mystery ball, which is a bunch of pitches that behave in very odd ways, and they strike out the remaining pirates in that way. So they manage to just barely win, and it's all very complicated. The trivia on the wiki suggests that the music that's playing while Kyon is pitching is actually a slightly sillier version of the music from an anime called Touch, which is an 1980s sports-themed anime, which is just an interesting little bit of trivia. I think there's actually a lot of good music in this episode. Some of it is pieces that we hear in other episodes as well, but in any event. So as they have managed to win, they basically come up with a plan that Koizumi, who mentions something about needing to go and meet with his associates, it seems related to the closed space in some way that is not fully explained, and perhaps we will learn, because Kyon seems to understand it. So he has to leave, and they use that to make up an excuse for forfeiting. But it's interesting to note, again, this is as we are starting to further develop Haruhi's character, even in this non-chronological way. We have Haruhi, who seems delusional and unreasonable and even a bully in a lot of ways, but she reacts pretty reasonably to Kyon coming up with a reasonable excuse for something and acting like, well, we had fun, but I'm tired now. Maybe we should stop. As opposed to just shooting down her idea. And at that point, she seems like she wanted to keep going in the tournament, but all right, if you're okay with it, we'll stop. And I think that's interesting. And then, of course, we get a coda of the episode where she comes in, and now she wants the SOS Brigade to enter either a soccer or American football tournament. Yeah. And doesn't seem to even know anything about those sports. But in the meantime, so this is a fun little standalone episode that's got lots of interesting stuff. And I think, again, it's fun to go from just learning that Yuki is an alien and having no idea what that means or why she's here, and going to seeing an episode like this where she is using strange abilities. I think it's fun to jump from learning, or not in the first couple of episodes, it's not like we were surprised to you learn that there's something going on with Haruhi. She's clearly the central character, even though she's weird. But to learn Yuki says she's an alien and there's something about Haruhi, to going to these various suggestions that Haruhi's anger could end the world and that her will can, could, take over. But the key also seems to be she doesn't know. She doesn't know those things. So in any event, we'll continue and see how that develops. So the next episode we're going to watch is actually The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya Part 3, which is going to pick up on the cliffhanger from the previous episode, where we had just learned Yuki had just explained to Kyon that she's an alien. So we're going to pick up from there in that episode next week. And in the meantime, I will talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.